Section 23 of Richelieu by George Joseph Gustave Masson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 8. Literature, Part 1. Literature had undergone already a substantial reform at the hands of Malherbe. After the eccentricities of the school of Ronsard, and the absurd attempts made by the members of the Pléiade to deprive the French language of its national character, a reaction was inevitable, and it was conducted with a great deal of tact and of good sense by the poet whom its detractors affected to style le tyran des mots et des syllabes. Enfin, Malherbe vint, says Boileau, and there is no doubt that Malherbe's influence over the grammar and the structure of the language was of the most beneficial description. Unfortunately, his genius was not equal to his critical talent. He had neither imagination nor fancy, and candidates for literary fame thought that he did not make sufficient allowance for these two last qualities. The vicissitudes of war, political marriages, and other circumstances had brought about frequent intercourse between France on the one hand, and Italy and Spain on the other. The literary masterpieces of these two countries had found their way to Paris across the Pyrenees and the Alps, and the question soon suggested itself to the habitués of fashionable drawing-rooms, whether the high-sounding phrases of Lope de Vega and Diamante on the one side, and the concetti of the Cavalier Marino on the other, were not superior to the stilted productions of Malherbe. Hence, two schools of writers in France, corresponding with the reign of Louis XIII, the one represented by Voiture and the other by Balzac. Both rose to immediate popularity from totally different causes, and became the idols of the Paris salon, or of the assemblies corresponding to what we should now call salons. After the end of the wars of religion, and when French society had settled down into the enjoyment of refined and intellectual pleasures, a number of fashionable centres were formed, presided over by ladies of taste and fashion, all equally characterized by the love of literature, but differing from each other in their minor features, according to the special disposition of the mistress of the house. Before inquiring into the subjects of the conversations and discussions carried on in these réunions, let us endeavour to form some idea of the part of Paris where fashion and wit used to assemble. During the last century, the Faubourg Saint-Germain was the great centre. Now the Champs-Élysées and its neighbourhood holds the sway. 200 years ago, no one who had any feeling of self-respect would have dreamed of residing elsewhere than in the Ile Saint-Louis or the Place Royale especially. When you entered that square, says Viscount d'Avenel, by its real approach the Rue Royale near the Rue Saint-Antoine, you found on the right-hand side the Hôtel de Rouen, on the left the Hôtel de Chaulnes, the splendid apartments of which have been celebrated by Bois-Robert, and which has since become the property of the Nicolai family. At the angles, near the Rue de Tournelle, stood the Hôtel de Saint-Géron, de Nouveau, now used as a mairie town hall, the hotel of the Countess de Moor, and that of the Marchioness de Sable. Further on lived Président de l'Escalopier, in a house which has until quite recently belonged to the family of its original owners. The square consisted of 37 pavilions supported by a covered gallery. Several acts of Corneille's monture and of his Place Royale allude to the conversations which took place under the arcades. In the former of these plays, Cliton, Doran's servant, familiar with Parisian usages, speaking of a lady, says, "Elle loge à la place, et son nom est Lucrèce." That would be quite sufficient under the reign of Louis XIII to designate la Place Royale. Just as when we now say Le Bois, it means exclusively Le Bois de Boulogne. Scarron, a few years later on, said, Adieu, belle place où n'habite que mainte personne d'élite. It is probably in the Place Royale, says M. Cousin, that Descartes, chatting with Pascal, suggested to him his fine experiments on the atmosphere. There also Detou, on leaving Madame de Guémenet's salon, received from Saint-Mars the information about the conspiracy which was to bring him to the scaffold. During the reign of Louis XIII, several salons enjoyed successively the patronage of the fashionable world. They owed their popularity to the courtesy and accomplishments of the master and mistress of the house, the refined manners they encouraged and of which they set the example, the tone of the conversations, and the character of the guests. All these circumstances helped to establish that popularity and to make it lasting. Marshal Bassompierre was amongst the first to have at-homes of that kind. His house was the rendezvous of the 17 noblemen, 17 seigneurs. Nothing was more agreeable than the decent freedom which prevailed there. No ceremony whatever. Everyone sat down where he happened to be, and those who came in the latest took their place at the table, although the others had been there long before. As the guests came in without saying good day, so they left without saying good bye, some soon, some late, according to their business. 15 years afterwards, the Duchesse de Beauharn's reunions took the place of Bassompierre's. She allowed exactly the same liberty. In fact, if we may believe Talmont des Réaux, she contributed in no slight degree to make young men lose the respect formerly paid to ladies. For in order to draw them into her coterie, she allowed them to take every kind of liberty. Montglat talks of the Messieurs de Marais, name given to the part of Paris where the Place Royale is situated, who used to assemble every evening at the house of Madame de Rohan. Saint-Mars belonged to that society, and preferred it to the Louvre. The Comtesse de Soissons had her levee at the Hôtel de Créqui. The Princesse de Condé held hers at the Hôtel de Ventadour. There was a great rivalry between these two groups. The habitués of the one would scarcely condescend to notice those of the other, and, to use a military expression, kept on terms of armed neutrality. History, however, has forgotten the 17 seigneurs, the Messieurs de Marais, and the other centres of more fashionable life, and has immortalised merely the salons where literature was cultivated. Those we mean of Madame de Rambouillet and of Mademoiselle de Scudéry. Had it not been for them, the précieux style would never have remained so long and so much in repute. We should not have seen springing up, not only in Paris, but from one end of France to the other, those innumerable societies, humble and unpretending on the one hand, ambitious and refined on the other, which contributed in a remarkable manner to spread, even in the lowest classes of the bourgeoisie, a taste for intellectual pursuits. It is true that exaggeration and affectation were one of the results of this movement, but we find here only an additional evidence of the genuine good which such societies produced, and we must always remember that what is really worthless does not often run the chance of being caricatured. Mademoiselle de Scudéry's Samedi have had due honour paid to them by M. Victor Cousin and M. Sainte-Beuve. There might be found Madame Cornuelle, Madame de Sévigné, Conrart, Ménage, Pélisson, etc., etc. There was planned and designed the famous Carte du Tendre, in which the vocabulary of love was made to sound like the articles of a gazetteer. There the various habitués, assuming names borrowed from classical antiquity, paraded about their high-flown language under the protection of Greek and Latin designations. Mademoiselle de Scudéry herself was Sappho, l'illustre Sappho, or la 10e Meuse. Sarrazin, Polyander, Conrart, Deodama, Pélisson, Acanthe, or the Chronicler, because he was the secretary of the society. The Duc de Saint-Aignan became Artaban. Monsieur de Rancy agatyrs, and Isarn xenocrate. Conrar has preserved the account of one of these samedi. He has offered to the fair hostess a signet made of crystal, together with a madrigal of his own composition. She answered by another madrigal, and all the other persons present, fired with enthusiasm, followed suit. The day was called La Journée des Madrigaux. The most notable of these reunions was held at the Hôtel de Rambouillet, in that famous Salon Bleu, where round the Marchioness de Rambouillet assembled the bevy of précieux and précieuses. It is unfortunate that for the great majority of readers the guests of the incomparable Art Denis should be associated with the Philaminte and the Bélises of the Femmes Savantes, or the Cathos and Madelons of the Précieuses Ridicules. But if the blue stockings of those days were not sparing enough in their use of metaphors, it cannot be denied that they did excellent service as reformers of the French language, and Saumais's Grand Dictionnaire des Précieuses is an invaluable source of information respecting the origin of many expressions which have retained their place in the French vocabulary. How often, for instance, do we say of a person who keeps low company, "Cet homme sans canaille"? And yet this expression, at the time when it was first used, was considered as perfectly ridiculous. In Molière's Critique de l'École des Femmes we find the following curious dialogue. Climene. Il est vrai que le goût des gens est étrangement gâté là-dessus, et que le siècle s'encanaille furieusement. Élise. Celui-là est joli encore, s'encanaille. Est-ce que vous qui l'avez inventé, madame? Climene. Hein! Élise. Je m'en suis bien douté. A large number of words and phrases shared the fate of s'encanailler. Denounced at first as affected and unnatural, they gradually obtained, so to say, their rights of citizenship. N'avoir que le masque de la vertu, être sobre dans ses discours, tenir bourreau d'esprit, and many other expressions which we might quote are of like origin, and must not be flung aside on the plea that when Mademoiselle de Scudéry wanted the servant to snuff a candle, she exclaimed, "Inutile, retranchez le superflu de cet ardent." Literary and social gatherings speedily multiplied in Paris. At the Hôtel de Condé, at the Palais Cardinal, the merits of a sonnet, a madrigal, or an epigram were laboriously discussed. At the Luxembourg, Mademoiselle de Montpensier and her guests, anticipating upon La Bruyère and Vauvenargues, delighted in writing characters or portraits of each other. Madame de Sablé's salon was frequented by the Jansenists of Port-Royal. Ménage, ridiculed by Molière under the name of Vadius, tried to give to his Mercurial (Wednesday reunions) an air of sprightliness and wit which was not the usual features of his character. But if the Hôtel de Rambouillet stood facile princeps at the head of the aristocratic drawing-rooms, the salon of Mademoiselle de Scudéry easily carried off the palm amongst those which represented the intellectual and cultivated bourgeoisie. The illustrious Sappho, as she was called, has often, and deservedly perhaps, been the butt of satire on account of her long-winded romances, but we must remember that our point of view cannot be the same as that occupied by the critics 2 centuries ago, and making every allowance for the tediousness of Le Grand Sirou and Clélie, Histoire Romaine, the lady who numbered amongst her supporters persons such as Madame de Sévigné, La Fontaine, Huet, Fléchier, Bossuet, the Duc de Montausier, must have had some literary merit to justify her popularity. We cannot help giving one brief paragraph to the brother of the famous Madeleine, Georges, who was the braggadocio of 17th century literature, who would have run a critic through with his rapier, and felt that by doing so he was merely avenging the dignity of his profession. Boileau's appreciation of him is well known. Bien heureuse Scudéry, dont la fertile plume peut tous les mois sans peine enfanter en volume. Tes écrits, il est vrai, sans art et languissants, semblent être formés en dépit du bon sens. Mais ils trouvent pourtant, quoi qu'on en puisse dire, en marchant pour les vendre et des sots pour les lire. His most celebrated works are his tragedies, Ligue d'Amont, 1629, L'amour tyrannique, 1638, and an epic poem, Alaric, where a few felicitous couplets disappear under the influence of surrounding absurdities. The share which the Hôtel de Rambouillet had in reforming and enriching French literature has been variously estimated. Whilst Viscount d'Avenel is rather inclined to depreciate it, M. Roederer, Histoire de la Société Polie, falls, we believe, into the opposite exaggeration. The truth, as usual, is to be found midway. If this celebrated salon had had only the result of introducing to the noblesse the aristocracy which results from genius and talent, it would deserve a distinguished place in the annals of belles lettres. We are told that the apparition of Voiture's sonnet on Job and Benserrade's on Uranie was an event quite as important as the battles of Lens and of Rocroi, and this fact alone shows to what dignity the position of a man of letters had risen then. We must not forget, too, that the real précieux and précieuses were not those whom Molière dragged on the stage in his amusing comedy, and this is so true that when the précieuses ridicules appeared on the stage for the first time, the whole of the habitués of the Hôtel de Rambouillet went to see the performance, and were the loudest in cheering the author. Madame de Sévigné herself used to boast of the title, feeling conscious that Molière's satire could only be levelled at clumsy and pedantic imitators. All the intellectual centres we have just enumerated were governed by the laws of the strictest propriety. Although gentlemen were permitted to act the innamorato's part, and to be thoroughly acquainted with Mademoiselle de Scudéry's famous Carte du Tendre, yet their passion must be of the purest and most platonic kind possible. In fact, the coarseness and the licentiousness of the 16th century had brought about a reaction verging upon the grotesque. This hardly suited a society of young men such as Saint-Amand, Théophile de Villot, Farret, who, like their intellectual forefathers, Villon, Regnier, etc., were fonder of Epicureanism than of sentiment. So, as a sort of protest against the collet monté style of the Chambre Bleue and of Sappho's Saturdays, cabarets d'honneur were opened for the benefit of the bohemians of literature, and there poems were read and drinking songs composed, which, if not generally distinguished by refinement, frequently contained a sparkling couplet or two, a touching passage, and a delicate thought neatly expressed. Thus Villon, Mais où sont les neiges d'antan? finds its counterpart in Saint-Amand's lines, Les épais promenoirs de ces vertes allées, où tant d'afflictions ont été consolées. We have thus attempted to give a slight idea of the various endeavours made to restore in France the spirit of sociability, combining with it the taste for intellectual pursuits. Voiture's wit, incessantly sparkling like a display of fireworks, but quite as unsubstantial, resulted in all the puerilities of the précieuse literature, and it is a pity that a man who could write such letters as the Lettres de la Carpe Brochet and the Lettres sur la prise de Corbie should have wasted his time upon riddles, jokes, and puns. The prose of Balzac, on the other hand, stilted, artificial, and elaborate, tended to destroy every spontaneity in composition, and under the pen of a mere imitator would become utter nonsense. In Molière's comedy Les Femmes Savantes, the couplet Ne dis plus qu'il est amarante, dis plutôt qu'il est demarante is a specimen of the worst Voiture. The amusing speech of Thomas Diaphorus in the Malade Imaginaire reminds us a little of Balzac. The contrast between the character of Voiture and that of Balzac is quite as amusing as that which we find between their respective talents. The former might perhaps be accused of wanting dignity, but on the other hand, how agreeable he was, how kind, how unselfish. With Balzac the case is quite different, and his style is the best clue perhaps to his moral nature. Eaten up with vanity, he sees nothing beyond himself, and the admiration, the engouement which he inspires, causes him to believe that he really is a paragon of perfection. Contemporary writers inform us that out of politeness he always took off his hat when he spoke about himself, which accounted for the fact that he so often suffered from cold in the head. Referring to the death of his father, he one day said in a letter, "Since I last wrote to you, I have lost that good-natured old father of mine, mon bonhomme de père." Of course he was never married. The cares and anxieties which accompany family life would have proved too great a trial for his intense selfishness. "I do not want," says he, "to be obliged to count every day the hairs of my wife, in order to feel quite sure that she is faithful. As for children, if they are ill-disposed and wicked, they will long after my death. If they happen to be good, they will expect it, at any rate, and think of it sometimes, even supposing they were the best principled children in the world. I will have none of that." Balzac, so heartless and indifferent about home affections, is quite as careful not to allow patriotism and philanthropy to disturb his repose. "We should never have done," says he, "if we wished to take to heart the concerns of this world, or feel anxious for the good of the public, of which we form only a very small part. If we regard all men as our relatives, we must make up our mind to wear mourning all our life long." These sentiments are very different from Terence's homo sum, and if it is true that genuine eloquence rises from the heart, Balzac was not eloquent. End of section 23.